Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Benjamin Eldon Stevens, and this is a recording of a paper I'm presenting at the Conference on Classics and Ancient History held at the University of Coimbra, June 2021, the panel on necropolitics. My paper is on a necropolitics of posthuman bodies, ? Yorgos Lanthimos' The Lobster, and the killing of a sacred deer. A major question facing anyone interested in both classics and necropolitics is whether the former does more than fall under cover of the latter. Given that ancient societies are at least partly properly considered bio, thanato, or necropolitical, might the analysis work in the opposite direction and past structures speak to present experience, the dead teaching us about this state of living death? The possibility is complicated, as ever, by the fact that we don't simply have antiquity, we have classics, that is, constructions of the past in modern disciplines and other cultural imaginaries. We have traditions and receptions. With that in mind, let me frame the question more specifically. If classical antiquity has been a point of reference for modernity, but more recently modernity has been exposed as not humanistic, indeed dehumanizing, then what happens to classical humanism? Might a necropolitics of ancient worlds help rehumanize the modern? I believe so, by putting the body before the being, a kind of posthumanism, confirming that this is already a world without us. Since necropolitics makes clear that there are indeed bodies buried under culture, I read examples of classical reception as unearthing the secret histories of modernity and sovereignty, a kind of Foucauldian archaeology as politically progressive anarchaeology. To try to do that in this talk, I focus on classical receptions in films in two contexts, bio, thanato, and necropolitical theory, and the study of horror. For of all modern genres, horror seems most deeply committed to representing the body as a site of political signification, and often in context of freighted engagement with the past. In that connection, I draw on some general studies of the genre in that medium, as well as some recent readings of horror films as thanato-political. This forms part of a larger project on classical receptions in horror, extending work on science fiction and fantasy as fictions of forbidden knowledge. I argue that antiquity serves well as a field, source, site, and symbol for monstrosity, and what it demonstrates or shows is the horror underlying the modern world, with, as we'll see, space for comedy, for Lanthimos seems to find all of this very funny. Part of the Lobster's engagement with antiquity seems evident in this, its iconic final scene. David, Colin Farrell, is about to blind himself by gouging his eyes out with a knife, echoing Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannos. But if Oedipin on its surface, this moment and with it the film, may not be Sophoclean. First, the event itself is aporetic. The last we see David, he is still knife in hand, and so we don't know whether he blinds himself or not. The film might thus do classical tragedy one better, refusing not only to show violence on stage, but even to determine if it occurs. The question is crucial for tragedy as for biopolitical modernity. Is there a history of violence, and therefore reason for nemesis, or more positively, reconciliation? This complication runs deep, since the potential blinding is also motivated differently. David wishes to match the object of his desire, Rachel Weisz, whose nameless character has been blinded. Although we could say that David has reached this point through a kind of learning, he has not obviously learned about his own unwitting participation in tragedy. Stretching, we could argue that his would-be relationship with a sociopath maps Oedipus's with Jocasta insofar as it too involves a killing within his family. The sociopath kills David's brother. A deeper tragedy, however, adheres to this kind of superficial but consequential matching at work throughout the film. David's dilemma is tragic insofar as there is no good option. He must blind himself since he loves Weisz, and in the film's fictive society, pair bonding requires performable similarity. Thus, another character fakes nosebleeds to partner with a real nosebleeder and so forth, an absurd setup which is yet the ironclad rule. Anyone who fails to find a life partner before a certain age is changed into an animal in a transformation room. David has thus specified that should he fail, he will become a lobster, arguing pathetically that, quote, lobsters mate for life, as if choosing one's manner of execution changes the fact of getting killed. The tragic fact is there is no way out of normativity. Such non-normativity, failure at romantic comedy, marks one as non-human, that is, as animal, a marking also signaled in how singletons, people who refuse to take part in matchmaking, are hunted in the woods by the would-be daters armed with rifles shooting tranquilizer darts. With the resolutely middle-class aspirants thus aping the old noble pursuit of most dangerous game, the lobster sets its own sights on modern psychologizing, that is, on culture limiting identity to personal desire that must be sexual and performable in middle-brow consumerist forms such that consumers become willing executioners of themselves. On this reading, the society at issue, the polis, is transformation room writ large. As Foucault saw, there is no choice but animal, that is, signing up to be non-human matter in the slaughterhouse. And yet, is there also a progressive or a destabilizing potential? To that possibility, we'll return. Classical reception in The Killing of a Sacred Deer is implied in the title and manifest in the plot, which turns more directly on the question of match, or more precisely, substitute, echoing the evident medical context, parmakon. Is there any making up or making sacred sacrificing for grievous loss? In human terms, the question is unanswerable. Thus, for example, Judith Butler has emphasized precarity, and biopolitics, to the contrary, are abominable. But so too, a story like Deer's, and in this way it is like Lobster's, is tragedy, insofar as an impossible answer is nonetheless demanded. A man has been killed, and a surviving relative demands an equivalent death from the killer's family. As pictured here, a boy named Martin, whose father died in surgery, tells the surgeon, Stephen, once again Colin Farrell, that he must choose which of his two children will thus die. As Stephen delays, violence is visited upon both children supernaturally. They are paralyzed, they lose their appetites, they bleed from the eyes, and so forth. That is, their bodies are abjected, as per Julia Kristeva, unless and until one is made sacred or sacrificed. If the story is thus in the tradition of myths like Iphigenia at Aulis, here too classical tragedy is modulated by motive and history of violence, by modern society, and by indeterminacy. Stephen, a lauded surgeon, is hardly Agamemnon, and any warlike cause is rearguard action against the inexorable Martin. Crucially, Martin himself professes not to know why all this happens. It just does, and yet he plays the role of antagonist who is more dangerous when confined, like the stranger in Euripides' Bacchae and like several modern monsters, including Hannibal Lecter and Jonathan Demme's 1991 The Silence of the Lambs. Of course, such strangers as monsters demonstrate reflecting the self's monstrosity. For technically it is not Artemis who kills Iphigenia, or Bacchus who beheads Pentheus, and so forth. This Bacchic aspect shows, too, why such a discipline of reasons as medical science fails. It is rather configured to conceal the truth, hiding the secret history of what happens to bodies. A sacred deer thus exposes how bodies matter as objects, or rather abjects, of this desire. From this perspective, the oikos, the household, is an extension of the operating theater, a banal location for extraordinary rendition, a black site. The oikos thus internalizes the logic of the state, which, as Foucault has shown, is that of the slaughterhouse, as Agamben has shown that of the camp. If the epistemological failure in the film is technoscientific medical, the underlying failure is ethical. The medical doctor in particular will not accept his complicity, how his position enables him to inflict violence. But others' homes and other spaces too are sites of abjection and, as we will see, absurdity. Taking the two films and their classical receptions together then means taking them at their words, that is, names, names for animals, names those animals cannot speak for themselves. There is a lobster, or there will be, a lobster made of human flesh. There is a deer identified as sacred and a demand for equivalent human sacrifice. The horror, of course, is that all of this is ordinary and ordering. Lobster's science fictional aspects aside, and notwithstanding deer's supernaturalism, the films expose, literally, they develop images of the secret of history, since the only knowledge allegedly separating humans from animals is knowledge of their own mortality, since in the end, bodies do not matter, but only are matter, culture is the work of getting persons to self-identify, to name themselves as animals, and those animals to lead themselves to the slaughter. This is emphasized in the films by mundanity and absurdity. The Lobster's iconic ending is set at a highway truck stop diner. David and Weiss's characters sit in a booth by the window, traffic passing, drinking only water, and ordering no food because they are not really people in this system. Will David do what it takes, accepting the violence required to be granted human rights, including, crucially, the ability to turn others' bodies into meat? In fact, he has already done so, changing the sociopath into an unspecified animal in recompense for the loss of his own sacred deer, his brother, the dog. Here, David is close indeed to Oedipus, who is first marked by answering correctly a question posed by a human-animal hybrid about which being's body always changes, and thus frees a polis from pestilence by internalizing it. He is that embodied being, and his oikos now embodies wrongness. Thus, David, ordering no food, rightly asks for a steak knife to use on himself. The final scene in Sacred Deer is similar. Stephen and his surviving family, including wife Nicole Kidman and daughter, are finishing a meal in a diner when Martin comes in to eat. They cannot continue eating, having no appetite or at least no desire for food, since they do have desire, which we see as the daughter casts a last lingering look at Martin, a reminder that she attempted to free her family by professing love for him and a willingness to run away with him, Iphigenia acting while Agamemnon dithered, and had previously told him, "You have a great body." Martin's body is thus marked. We see the bruise on his cheekbone, including other visible traces of the violence done to him in Stephen's basement. Stephen, attempting to free his family without making a choice, chose to beat him, but Martin outdid the man by biting a chunk out of his own forearm. Martin is thus monstrous only insofar as he fully accepts the premise of culture, namely, bodies are objects and abjects of desire. In context of such bodily category mistakes built into bourgeois consumerism, is there an argument for different modes of consumption? For example, vegetarianism? We will thus consider the lobster below. If other diners knew the histories nearby, would they lose their appetites or deepen them? In fact, they and we do know. There is no not knowing now what happens to bodies, and disciplines and other institutions make only the barest difference in what Agamben calls bare life. Bodies are always already marked, scarred, that is, inscribed, in ways to make history a matter and material, but as if for specialists only. The sciences, the police, and the military, esoteric fields all working together to hide from view the body and its histories. Only thus is it possible, the ongoing transformation of living body into raw material, or Heidegger's standing reserve. Bio, necro, and thanato political study has thus exposed this fantasy of disembodiment as in fact complicity in others' precarity and living death. That central fact of culture's fiction has also been treated in scholarship considering alternatives to the human, increasingly with direct application to classics. Sadly, as a field of study contemporaneous with other knowledge projects of imperialism, classics is recognizable as a kind of company store for modernity, selling images of humanism. Many of us have thus been finding reflections of all this in classical receptions and speculative fiction, including science fiction and fantasy, arguing that these are knowledge fictions, that is, images of contests over what may be known, including about the past. Recent studies have thus sought to theorize classical reception as encounter with things not rightly living or dead, somehow undead or spectral. This theorization draws on Gothic and leads to horror, quote, a genre tied uniquely to a single source of ultimate horror, the very act of knowing. That is, a kind of forbidden knowledge fiction, showing what happens to bodies when living and dead are deliberately confused. As Judith Halberstam has put it, if bodies should matter, they are matter, and horror shows how they splatter. In its excess, horror is thus a rigorously realist and historicist genre, and thus opens up a space for sharp or knife-edged comedy? Let us see. Crucially, the genre is not always explicit in order to horrify. In the cultural context exposed by thanato-political study, it is destabilizing enough to show the effects of violence on bodies. For ideally, the body must show no history, which may occur only elsewhere, off-site and farther down the human food chain as assembly line. The parallel to outsourced manual labor is emphasized. The lobster's transformations are surgical, accomplished technologically and manually. Deer's main character is, of course, a surgeon, and seeking to uncover the secret history behind the story, Deer's Nicole Kidman gets a hold of medical records as pictured here only by taking hold of a man's penis, masturbating him in a car in a parking garage. The setting, like the diners, is a not place, a utopia, emphasizing the dystopic nature of that obligatory act. The act, too, is of a piece. If Stephen has killed antiseptically and off-screen, Kidman's character focalizes death and little death in and around her body, at this point bringing an anesthesiologist to orgasm, and earlier in parallel agreeing to what is evidently a regular sexual role play with Stephen in which she pretends to be unconscious, an act they call general anesthesia. Here, clearly, is an image of privileged play acting at what other, more precarious classes and beings cannot avoid, at best, an ethically flawed consent to other states of living death. In this way, Kidman's character is opposite and yet equivalent to an other in the film, Martin's mother, played by Alicia Silverstone. The surface of her life is more obviously desperate. We see her only in the single location, her somewhat shabby home, where she has prepared for Stephen a sadly risible evening of seduction consisting of dinner and dessert, including her own body. "You're not leaving until you've had my tart," she shouts as he flees, having already taken his, quote, beautiful hands into her mouth and hoping that he finds her body great, as she has been described dissonantly by her own son. Her character is therefore different from Kidman's only in circumstance, that is, in history, and since history again is forbidden to bodies, awareness of that difference is discomfiting. It is, by definition, knowledge that there has always already been lasting harm. But for Lanthimos, finally, it also seems like laughing harm, for, as per the pun on tart, he finds this all very funny. That can be discomfiting indeed. When Sacred Deer premiered at Cannes, it was booed by the jury, perhaps recognizing that the most horrific genre of all is romantic comedy. This is all camp, and so it comes uncomfortably close to showing how the premise of modern society is, as Agamben argues, the logic of the camp. Classical receptions help make clear, then, how Lanthimos is a comedian of the depredations of modernity. This is clear from the beginning. When The Lobster opens with a visual pun, an opening shot, a woman is driving her car, stops, gets out, and with a handgun shoots and kills a donkey. From later in the film, we may speculate the donkey was once human and did something in the woman's eyes to deserve this execution. But if we watch the rest of the film expecting a reason, that is in vain, for of course there can be none. A donkey, any mundane animal body, any body, must have no history. It cannot speak, and no one speaks or intervenes on its behalf. Not every donkey can be a sacred deer. Thus, in parallel, the narrator never learns what animal David turns the sociopath into, such that they could be, literally, any body. The indeterminacy is the point. Every body is exposed to this potential and actual violent treatment. And yet, as if for the blinded Homeric narrator, all is blurry. The same metaphysics could lead to different ethics. If in general bodies have no histories, what about what follows in the future or otherwise after? In particular, if in these stories we find echoes of Aristotelian traditions of classical tragedy, but no catharsis, is there yet some positive ethical possibility? In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle thus asks a horrifying question. Should eudaimonia, or happiness, be attributed to the dead? S.J. Murray argues that, quote, Agamben's conception of biopolitics is not radical enough, and so might be pulled up by the roots with further reference to Aristotle, whose, quote, more radical conception of the political allows us to see how death exceeds, in some sense, the juridical logic of the exception. On this reading, death offers a productive bafflement, a comedic aporia, that is, a way to interrupt, to momentarily suspend, or to meaningfully subvert biopolitical logic through thanatopolitics. This is different from envying the dead. It is rather noticing that death is not a simple not state, but a complex calling into different modes of being, modes that may be and are and always have been written into the differences between bodies. Here is a reason for Lanthimos's laughter. The obvious possibility of posthumanism, always, already, all around, and with it, a campy rejection of the logic of the camp. If bodies are always historically or potentially animal bodies, that is, if we are not living death, but rather living others' lives, then the entropy of body into corpse is one aspect only of endless physical change or transformation. It may be, then, that Lanthimos's films and others like them develop images not of necropolitics, but of, call it, somatopolitics, comedic visions of embodied life as endless and radical metamorphosis. Whether Lucretian, Ovidian, or Apuleian, I must reserve for a future study. Thank you very much.